Okay, let's jump straight into this deep dive. We're looking at these sources you shared about, well, the journey of Jim Carrey.
Hmm.
And it seems like quite a path laid out here from that, explosive early stand-up energy through becoming this huge Hollywood name and then into what these sources talk about as a more philosophical space.
That's exactly it. And the idea here, just using this specific material provided, is to really pull out the main insights,
Yeah.
understand the shifts he's talked about, and, what takeaways pop up about his work, sure, but also his whole perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. We all remember the performances, the ones that just made you ache from laughing.
Yeah.
But these sources seem to point to something else going on underneath, a personal evolution that honestly might surprise some people. Let's start right at the beginning.
Right.
The material talks about his early days, stand up. What was the driving force there? It sounds, well, intense.
It really does. The sources describe it with this rawness. He actually uses the word desperate, man. Desperate. Yeah, like this fire in him, this feeling that if he didn't make people laugh, he'd literally die.
Jai, that's heavy.
Isn't it? It wasn't just wanting it. The sources frame it as this really urgent, almost like a survival thing,
Yeah.
connecting through the comedy.
Okay, die if he didn't make people laugh. I mean, that kind of explains some of the sheer intensity you saw later, doesn't it?
It really does.
Makes that story about the electrocution bit,
Right.
makes it land differently.
Totally. He talked about that moment pretending to get shocked, spasming on stage,
Right.
and the audience freaks out at first, but then laughter. And he calls that reaction the drug.
Ah.
So according to these sources, it just shows how incredibly powerful that validation was early on, like a potent fuel for that whole fire and desperation thing we mentioned.
So from that raw, sometimes kind of confronting stand-up, he gets on to In Living Color, Fire Marshal Bill, all those iconic characters. What do the sources say about how he approached those sketches? Was it all tightly scripted like you might think for TV?
Not really, apparently. He calls it 90% chaos.
90%. Okay.
Yeah, the material suggests he wasn't the type to just, stick to the lines. He'd grab a sketch idea and just expand it, push it.
Right.
He gives that specific example, like, okay, maybe I burned my face, but what if I also sniff the flames?
Oh my gosh.
It just shows that instinct, right?
Yeah.
To always push for the most extreme, the most absurd take, even inside a TV show structure.
That impulse, that need to expand and embrace the chaos that must have helped propel him, because after that, it's just this meteoric rise.
Insanely fast.
Suddenly, he's the king of 90s comedy. Ace Ventura, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, bam, bam, bam.
Exactly. The sources really capture that speed. And you see that beautiful anarchy you talked about right there on screen.
Yeah.
Like that story about filming The Mask, where the crew just had to stop rolling because they were laughing too hard at the street dance scene.
I love that.
It just shows how that wild energy he developed earlier translated into massive mainstream hits.
But then the sources point to a shift, a pretty noticeable one. He starts doing dramatic roles. The Truman Show, Man on the Moon, Eternal Sunshine.
Right.
Why pivot right when he's at the absolute peak of his comedy game? What's the motivation described in this material?
He talks about it quite directly here. He says something really fascinating. Comedy is truth. And truth isn't always funny. And he wanted to explore that. So it suggests that for him, acting, comedy, drama, whatever, was all about exploring truth. And he felt maybe he needed to go beyond just the funny parts of truth, explore the other sides.
That's a really interesting way to think about comedy, that its root is truth.
It is, isn't it?
And speaking of truth, he apparently had this specific insight about the Truman Show, called it prophetic.
Yeah, he did. He saw that movie, the guy living in a totally fake world just for TV is incredibly ahead of its time.
Okay.
He connected us straight to social media, how we all kind of curate these online lives, living in our own fake domes, as he put it.
Wow. So even in the dramas, he was grappling with these big themes that felt maybe personal or definitely relevant to society? Kind of foreshadowing, maybe?
It seems that way.
Yeah.
It certainly seems to foreshadow some of the later stuff we see discussed in these sources.
Okay, right. So here's where this deep dive takes that turn you mentioned. Beyond the acting career, into more philosophical stuff. The sources mention him talking publicly about ego, presence, depression, things like that. How did this awakening, I guess you could call it, how did that come about based on what's here?
Well, the material links it pretty strongly to his huge success.
Yeah.
He actually describes it like this. Success was a trap.
A trap? How so?
No, he'd gotten everything right. Everything he thought he wanted, the fame, the money,
Yeah.
all that external stuff. But he found himself feeling miserable.
That's quite a contrast, having everything the world tells you to want but feeling miserable inside. What does that suggest based on these sources?
It suggests that the external winds just didn't fix whatever was going on internally,
Yeah.
or didn't fulfill that deeper need. And the sources highlight this key realization that came out of that misery. I'm not Jim Carrey. That's a character too.
Whoa. Okay, so the public persona,
Okay.
the super successful, energetic guy, he started seeing that as just another role.
That seems to be exactly it. Like
Yeah.
the guy who made us all laugh, the movie star. Just another character, like Fire Marshal Bill, in a way.
So if Jim Carrey is a character, what does he identify as the real self in this material?
That's the core of it, right?
Yeah.
He points to the real self not being the persona, not the roles, but what he calls the awareness behind the mask.
The awareness behind the mask.
Yeah, like the consciousness, the presence that's just watching the character, watching the experiences,
Yeah.
separate from the identity built up by career or fame or what people think. It's moving from being the character to being the awareness observing it.
That completely reframes his whole story, doesn't it?
It really does.
From that desperate need for validation for the character to realizing the character itself is just sort of temporary. Let's pull in a couple more of those specific little stories from the sources that kind of illustrate this. That prank on Jeff Daniels.
Oh, right. Yeah, before Dumb and Dumber, he apparently told Jeff Daniels it was going to be a serious drama.
No way.
Yep. Daniels bought it for like 3 days. It's hilarious, but it also kind of shows that playful blurring of reality and performance was always there, even just as a joke.
And there's that point about what people often get wrong about him personally.
Right. He mentions people thinking he's always on, that high energy guy all the time.
Yeah, you can see why they'd think that.
But he says he actually loves silence, which is just a small detail from the sources, but it pushes back against that public image, doesn't it? And hints at that quieter inner space he seems to value now.
And what about that idea for Ace Ventura 3, that playful, hypothetical one?
Oh, yeah. He kind of threw out this idea that Ace could come back, but this time he'd be a deeply enlightened pet detective. It's funny, obviously tongue-in-cheek, but it perfectly blends his iconic comedy past with this philosophical exploration he's talked about. It shows how those different parts of his journey, according to these sources, could maybe, I don't know, coexist now?
So pulling this all together from the material you shared,
Yeah.
we've tracked this pretty amazing arc.
Yeah.
From that raw, almost desperation-fueled physical comedy through hitting the absolute top in Hollywood.
Yeah.
And then this major turn towards questioning identity itself and seeking
Awareness, as he calls it. The real thread here, just based on this material, seems to be that shift from being driven by external stuff, needing the laughs, chasing success, to this really profound idea that the whole external identity that Jim Carrey is basically a character.
Right.
And the real search is about connecting with that awareness underneath, not the mask.
It definitely makes you think. I mean, for you listening, what does this journey bring up about, say, the nature of identity, or about chasing success all the time, or, finding meaning that isn't just about what other people think? It's a lot to chew on.
It really does challenge the standard story of success, doesn't it? It asks us to look more inward, maybe, than just at the outside stuff.
And the sources leave us with this one final thought. It feels like it kind of distills a lot of this. It's, quote, "You're not the voice in your head. You're the one listening. Now go play. Life's a game. Stop taking it so seriously."
Yeah. That quote, presented in the sources as his view, seems to perfectly capture that shift. From the earlier, maybe heavier striving towards a lighter, more detached kind of awareness. It's a pretty powerful note to end this deep dive on.